what I'm doing against these criminals is not the answer for the tragedy, but this is a warning for the murderers of tomorrow.
As the world sought justice for the horrors of the Nazi regime, Nuremberg became the epicenter of accountability. High-ranking officials who once orchestrated war and genocide now faced their ultimate judgment.
Answer the indictment on which you have been convicted. Tribunal sentences you to death by hanging. Death by hanging. Fritz Saukel, death by hanging.
Yet beyond the famous verdicts lies a darker chapter, the fate of the bodies after execution. Join us as we unravel the secrets of the trials and the grim fate of the bodies left behind. The hunt begins, capturing the Nazi war criminals. As the flames of World War II were extinguished, the Allied forces embarked on a relentless pursuit of justice. The Nazi regime had orchestrated unspeakable atrocities, and those responsible had to be held accountable. The hunt for Nazi war criminals began in earnest, with Allied soldiers scouring every corner of Germany to bring the perpetrators to justice. The task was daunting, as many high-ranking Nazis had fled or taken their own lives. Adolf Hitler, the mastermind behind the Third Reich, took his own life in his Berlin bunker, along with his propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels. Heinrich Himmler, the ruthless head of the SS, had also chosen to end his own life rather than face the consequences of his actions. But not all Nazi leaders had evaded capture. Robert Ley, the head of the German Labor Front and a senior Nazi official, was apprehended by American forces in Bavaria. Ley, known for his corruption and abuse of power, had amassed a fortune by exploiting German workers and plundering trade union funds. He was taken to a detention center in Luxembourg, where the Allies had set up a special facility to hold high-ranking Nazi prisoners. However, Ley's story took a dramatic turn. Facing the prospect of trial and punishment for his crimes, Ley decided to take matters into his own hands. In a final act of defiance, he fashioned a noose from a towel and tied it to a toilet pipe in his cell. Ley took his own life, robbing the Allies of the opportunity to bring him to justice. Capturing Robert Ley was just one piece of the larger puzzle. Allied forces faced immense challenges in tracking down the numerous war criminals who had scattered across Germany. Many had gone into hiding, while others had fled to distant corners of the world. The Allies had to rely on intelligence, cooperation from local authorities, and the determination of their soldiers to locate and apprehend these individuals. The indictment, bringing the Nazis to justice. With the Nazi war criminals in custody, the Allies faced the monumental task of bringing them to justice. The Nuremberg Trials, a series of military tribunals, were established to prosecute the highest-ranking Nazi officials for their crimes against humanity. The process of indictment was a crucial step in ensuring that the most notorious perpetrators would face the consequences of their actions. The Allies had to carefully consider who would be indicted and gather sufficient evidence to build strong cases against them. Initially, 24 Nazi war criminals were selected to stand trial, but the final number was reduced to 21, as some defendants were deemed unfit or could not be located. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary and head of the Nazi Party Chancellery, proved to be an elusive figure. Despite extensive efforts to track him down, Bormann could not be found and was tried in absentia. Another notable absence from the defendant's dock was Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, a prominent German industrialist. Krupp was accused of using slave labor in his factories and manufacturing illegal weapons of war. However, due to his advanced age and deteriorating health, he was deemed unfit to stand trial. The indictment process was a meticulous and time-consuming endeavor. Allied prosecutors had to gather a vast array of evidence, including documents, witness testimonies, and physical artifacts, to build compelling cases against the accused. The sheer scale of the crimes committed by the Nazi regime made this task even harder. The Nuremberg Trials, a groundbreaking legal proceeding. The Nuremberg Trials, held in the war-torn city of Nuremberg, Germany, marked a pivotal moment in the history of international law. These trials were established to prosecute the Nazi war criminals and bring them to justice for their heinous crimes against humanity. The trials were a groundbreaking legal proceeding that set a precedent for holding individuals accountable for their actions, even in the context of war. Nuremberg was chosen as the location for the trials due to its symbolic significance and practical considerations. The city had been the site of grand Nazi rallies and was home to the infamous Nuremberg laws, which had stripped Jews of their citizenship rights. By holding the trials in Nuremberg, the Allies sought to dismantle the Nazi legacy and send a powerful message to the world. The defendants faced a range of charges, including crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy. These charges encompassed the systematic persecution and extermination of Jews, the brutal treatment of prisoners of war, the enslavement of civilian populations, and the waging of aggressive wars. The Nuremberg trials were a monumental undertaking, lasting from November 20th, 1945 to October 1st, 1946. During this time, the court held 403 open sessions, with simultaneous translations in 4 languages: English, French, German, and Russian. This was an unprecedented feat in legal history, as it ensured that the proceedings were accessible to a global audience. The trials were conducted by the International Military Tribunal, IMT, which consisted of judges from the 4 victorious Allied powers: the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. The prosecution team, led by American Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson, presented a staggering amount of evidence, including official documents, eyewitness testimonies, and film footage of Nazi atrocities. The impact of the Nuremberg trials extended far beyond the courtroom. They exposed the full extent of Nazi crimes to the world and provided a platform for victims and survivors to tell their stories. The trials also played a significant role in the denazification process, helping to purge Germany of its Nazi past and pave the way for a new, democratic future. The defendants, high-ranking Nazi officials on trial. The defendants who stood trial at Nuremberg were among the most notorious and high-ranking officials of the Nazi regime. These men had played pivotal roles in planning and executing some of the most heinous crimes in human history. From top military commanders to influential politicians and ideologues, the defendants represented the dark heart of the Nazi power structure. One of the most prominent defendants was Hermann Göring, Hitler's designated successor and the head of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. Göring was a flamboyant and influential figure, known for his love of luxury and his ruthless ambition. He had played a key role in the Nazis' rise to power and had overseen the plundering of art and cultural treasures from occupied territories. Another high-profile defendant was Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy and a key figure in the early days of the Nazi Party. Hess had flown to Scotland in 1941 on a mysterious solo mission, allegedly to seek peace with the British. He was captured and spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. At Nuremberg, Hess faced charges of conspiracy and crimes against peace. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Nazi foreign minister, was also among the defendants. Ribbentrop had played a central role in the Nazis' foreign policy, negotiating alliances and paving the way for Germany's aggressive expansion. He was a key architect of the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, which had allowed Germany to invade Poland and set the stage for World War II. Other notable defendants included Wilhelm Keitel, the head of the German Armed Forces High Command, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the chief of the Reich Security Main Office and a key figure in the implementation of the Holocaust, and Alfred Rosenberg, the Nazi Party's chief ideologue and the mastermind behind the systematic looting of cultural artifacts from occupied territories. The defendants represented a cross-section of the Nazi hierarchy, from military leaders to government ministers and SS officials. Each had played a significant role in the planning and execution of Nazi atrocities, from the persecution of Jews and other minority groups to the waging of aggressive wars and the brutalization of occupied populations. Throughout the trial, the defendants faced a mountain of evidence against them, including official documents, eyewitness testimonies, and film footage of Nazi crimes. Some, like Göring, remained defiant to the end, while others expressed varying degrees of remorse or sought to distance themselves from the regime's worst excesses. The verdicts. Justice served. After 315 days of intense trial proceedings, the moment of truth arrived on October 1st, 1946. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg had heard the evidence, the testimonies, and the defenses, and now it was time to deliver the verdicts. The world held its breath as the fate of the Nazi war criminals hung in the balance. In a tense and solemn atmosphere, the judges announced the verdicts one by one. 11 defendants, including some of the most notorious Nazi leaders, were sentenced to death by hanging. Among them were Hermann Göring, Hitler's designated successor and head of the Luftwaffe, Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister who had played a key role in the Nazis' aggressive foreign policy, and Wilhelm Keitel, the head of the German Armed Forces High Command. The death sentences sent a clear message that the atrocities committed by these men would not go unpunished. The Nuremberg Trials established a new standard of international justice, holding individuals accountable for crimes against humanity, regardless of their position or power. 3 defendants, including Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former deputy, received life sentences. Hess had flown to Scotland in 1941 on a mysterious solo mission and had been in Allied custody ever since. Despite his claims of amnesia and his erratic behavior during the trial, the judges found him guilty of conspiracy and crimes against peace. Other defendants received varying prison terms, ranging from 10 to 20 years. These sentences reflected the gravity of their crimes and their roles within the Nazi regime. The prison terms served as a reminder that justice would be served, even if it fell short of the ultimate punishment. The reactions of the defendants to their verdicts varied. Some, like Hess, remained defiant, refusing to acknowledge the authority of the court. Others, like Hans Frank, the former governor-general of occupied Poland, showed little emotion upon hearing their fate. Frank, who had been responsible for the brutal suppression of the Polish people, seemed resigned to his destiny. The verdicts at Nuremberg marked a significant milestone in the pursuit of justice. The trials had exposed the full extent of Nazi atrocities and had held the perpetrators accountable for their crimes. The sentences handed down sent a powerful message to the world that such actions would not be tolerated and that those responsible would face the consequences of their actions. Hermann Göring's final act, cheating the hangman. Hermann Göring, the most prominent defendant at the Nuremberg trials, had been sentenced to death by hanging for his role in the Nazi regime's atrocities. As the designated successor to Adolf Hitler and the head of the Luftwaffe, Göring had been a key figure in the planning and execution of Nazi crimes. His conviction and sentence were seen as a major victory for the Allies. However, just hours before his scheduled execution, Göring committed a final act of defiance. In a shocking twist, the once powerful Nazi leader managed to obtain a cyanide capsule and ingested it while in his prison cell. The news of Göring's passing sent shockwaves through the Allied camp and raised questions about how he had managed to evade the tight security measures in place. Theories began to emerge about how Göring had obtained the cyanide capsule. Some suggested that he had been assisted by a sympathetic guard, or that he had managed to smuggle the capsule into his cell during his time in captivity. Others speculated that Göring had been able to conceal the capsule in a hidden cavity in his body, evading detection during searches. Regardless of how he had obtained the means to take his own life, Göring's taking his own life was seen as a final act of defiance against the Allies. By choosing to die on his own terms, Göring had denied the Allies the opportunity to execute him and had robbed them of the satisfaction of seeing justice fully carried out. Göring's death also raised questions about the effectiveness of security measures at Nuremberg. The fact that such a high-profile prisoner had been able to obtain a lethal substance cast doubt on the Allies' ability to keep the other condemned Nazi leaders secure until their executions. The news of Göring's death sent a shockwave through the international community. Many saw it as a failure of justice, a final insult to the millions who had suffered and died at the hands of the Nazi regime. Others, however, saw it as a fitting end for a man who had been responsible for so much death and destruction. The executions, a grim spectacle. In the early hours of October 16, 1946, the condemned Nazi leaders were led to the gymnasium of the Nuremberg prison, where a makeshift gallows had been erected. The mood was somber and tense as Allied representatives and journalists gathered to witness the executions. The world was about to see justice done for some of the most heinous crimes in history. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the former Nazi foreign minister, was the first to face the gallows. Ribbentrop had been a key architect of the Nazis' aggressive foreign policy and had played a central role in the planning and execution of the Holocaust. As he was led to the platform, Ribbentrop remained defiant, proclaiming his loyalty to the Nazi cause until the very end. The executioner, Master Sergeant John C. Woods, placed the noose around Ribbentrop's neck and pulled the lever. One by one, the other condemned Nazi leaders were led to the gallows. Wilhelm Keitel, the head of the German Armed Forces High Command, followed Ribbentrop, his face stoic as he faced his fate. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the chief of the Reich Security Main Office and a key figure in the implementation of the Holocaust, went to his death with a sneer on his face, showing no remorse for his crimes. Alfred Rosenberg, the Nazi Party's chief ideologue, and Hans Frank, the former governor-general of occupied Poland, were among the others who were executed that morning. Each man faced the gallows with a different demeanor. Some were defiant, others resigned to their fate. The executions were witnessed by a small group of Allied representatives and journalists who watched in grim silence as the bodies of the condemned Nazi leaders swung from the gallows. The scene was one of somber justice, a reminder of the terrible price that had been paid for the crimes of the Nazi regime. As the last body was cut down from the gallows, the Allied representatives and journalists filed out of the gymnasium, their faces etched with the weight of what they had witnessed. The executions had been a grim spectacle, but they had also been a necessary one. The world had seen justice carried out, and the victims of Nazi atrocities could finally find some measure of peace. The aftermath, dealing with the bodies of the executed. In the wake of the Nuremberg executions, the Allies faced a daunting task: how to dispose of the bodies of the executed Nazi leaders without creating the potential for martyrdom or veneration. The fear was that if the burial sites were made public, they could become shrines for Nazi sympathizers and a rallying point for those who still clung to the abhorrent ideology. To prevent this, the Allies devised a covert plan to secretly dispose of the bodies. The first step was to document the deaths, with each body being photographed and carefully labeled to ensure a clear record of the executions. The bodies were then placed in plain wooden coffins, each marked with a false name to conceal the true identity of the deceased. Under the cover of darkness, the coffins were loaded onto military trucks, disguised as the remains of fallen American soldiers. The convoy, accompanied by a heavily armed escort, made its way through the war-torn streets of Nuremberg, heading towards Munich, some 100 miles to the south. Their destination was a crematorium located in the eastern part of the city, chosen for its capability to handle multiple cremations simultaneously. The staff at the crematorium were told that the bodies were those of American servicemen who had died in battle, a carefully crafted lie to ensure secrecy. Once the coffins arrived at the crematorium, the bodies were cremated one by one, a process that took several hours. The ashes of each executed Nazi leader were carefully collected and placed in separate containers, each labeled with the same false name that had adorned their coffin. The Allies then took the ashes to a predetermined location, a nondescript bridge over the Isar River on the outskirts of Munich. There, in the early hours of the morning, the ashes were scattered into the flowing waters, carried away by the current, forever erasing any physical trace of the executed Nazi leaders. The decision to scatter the ashes in a river was a deliberate one, designed to ensure that there would be no physical remains that could be venerated or memorialized. The Allies were determined to deny the Nazis any form of posthumous glory, and the scattering of the ashes was seen as the final act in the process of holding them accountable for their crimes. The mysterious case of Martin Bormann. Among the many Nazi leaders who faced justice at the Nuremberg Trials, one man remained conspicuously absent: Martin Bormann, Adolf Hitler's private secretary and head of the Nazi Party Chancellery. Bormann had been a powerful figure in the Nazi regime, responsible for managing Hitler's personal finances and overseeing the implementation of Nazi policies throughout Germany and the occupied territories. But as the war drew to a close and the Allied forces closed in on Berlin, Borman disappeared without a trace. Some believed that he had died in the chaos of the final days of the war, while others speculated that he had managed to escape and was living in hiding somewhere in Europe or South America. Despite the uncertainty surrounding his whereabouts, Borman was tried in absentia at the Nuremberg Trials and sentenced to death for his role in the Nazi regime's crimes. The Allies were determined to hold him accountable, even if he could not be physically present to face justice. In the years that followed, rumors and alleged sightings of Borman continued to surface. Some claimed to have seen him in Argentina, where many Nazi officials had fled after the war. Others reported seeing him in Brazil or Paraguay, where he was said to be living under an assumed name. But despite the many leads and investigations, no concrete evidence of Borman's whereabouts ever emerged. The mystery of his disappearance became one of the enduring legends of the post-war era, a subject of fascination for historians and conspiracy theorists alike. It wasn't until 1972, more than a quarter century after the end of the war, that the truth about Borman's fate finally came to light. Construction workers in Berlin uncovered human remains near the site of the former Nazi bunker where Hitler had spent his final days. Forensic analysis confirmed that the remains were those of Martin Bormann and that he had died in Berlin in May 1945, just days after Hitler's death. The discovery of Bormann's remains brought a measure of closure to one of the great mysteries of the post-war era, but it also raised new questions about the nature of his death and the circumstances that had led to his body being buried in an unmarked grave in the heart of Berlin. Some speculated that Bormann had been killed by Soviet troops as they closed in on the city, while others believed that he took his own life in the face of imminent capture. Still, others suggested that he had been murdered by his fellow Nazis, who feared that he might reveal their secrets if he were captured alive. The Executioner, John C. Wood's troubled past. John C. Woods, the U.S. Army Master Sergeant who served as the executioner at the Nuremberg hangings, was a man with a troubled past and a questionable reputation. Born in 1911 in Kansas, Woods had a history of run-ins with the law and had been discharged from the Army in 1930 for going AWOL. He later re-enlisted and was serving as a military policeman when he volunteered for the role of executioner. Woods claimed to have assisted in executions in Texas and Oklahoma, but these claims were later found to be false. In fact, Woods had no prior experience as a hangman and had only received a brief training session before being assigned to the Nuremberg executions. Despite his lack of experience, Woods was chosen for the job, and he approached it with a level of enthusiasm that some found disturbing. He was known for his crude behavior and his lack of professionalism, often making inappropriate jokes and comments about the condemned men. During the executions, Woods's performance was heavily criticized. Reports emerged of slow and painful deaths, with some of the condemned men taking up to 20 minutes to die. The executions were described as botched, with many of the condemned men suffering from strangulation rather than the intended quick death by a broken neck. Woods' behavior during the executions also raised concerns. He was reported to have been drinking heavily the night before and was seen laughing and joking with the other members of the execution team. Some witnesses described him as being nervous and shaky during the executions, further raising questions about his competence and state of mind. After the Nuremberg executions, Woods continued to serve as a military executioner, but his reputation was forever tainted by the controversies surrounding his performance. He was accused of being a butcher and a sadist, and many questioned whether justice had truly been served given the nature of the executions. Despite the criticisms, Woods remained unapologetic about his role in the Nuremberg executions. In a 1946 interview with the American magazine Stars and Stripes, Woods defended his actions, stating that hanging was too good for the condemned Nazi leaders and that they deserved a much worse fate. The fate of Nazi possessions, destruction, and souvenirs. As the Nuremberg trials drew to a close and the executed Nazi leaders' bodies were secretly disposed of, the Allies turned their attention to the possessions and symbols of the Nazi regime. The goal was to erase the vestiges of Nazi power and atrocities, to ensure that the symbols of hate and oppression would not endure. The first step was the systematic destruction of Nazi insignias, medals, and uniforms. These items, once proudly worn by the members of the Nazi party and military, were now seen as emblems of evil, a reminder of the atrocities committed in the name of the Third Reich. The Allies were determined to prevent these items from becoming relics or collector's items, fearing that they could be used to glorify the Nazi regime. Piles of Nazi uniforms were burned, their ashes scattered to the winds. Medals and insignias were defaced or melted down, and their precious metals were repurposed for more noble causes. The goal was to erase any physical trace of the Nazi regime, to deny future generations any tangible connection to the horrors of the past. However, not all Nazi possessions were destroyed. Some items, particularly those of significant monetary value, were confiscated by the Allies. Gold and silver, often looted from the victims of the Nazi regime, were sold off to help cover the costs of the Nuremberg Trials and the rebuilding of Europe. Other items, such as artworks and cultural artifacts, were returned to their rightful owners or to the nations from which they had been stolen. The Allies were determined to right the wrongs of the Nazi regime, to restore what had been taken, and to provide some measure of justice to those who had suffered. Despite the Allies' best efforts, some Nazi possessions managed to slip through the cracks. A few items were taken as souvenirs by Allied soldiers, who saw them as tangible reminders of their role in bringing the Nazi regime to justice. These items, ranging from small personal effects to larger, more significant artifacts, would resurface years later in auctions or private collections, a troubling reminder of the enduring fascination with the Nazi regime. The legacy of the Nuremberg Trials. The Nuremberg Trials, held in the aftermath of World War II, represented a turning point in the history of international criminal justice. For the first time, individuals were held accountable for crimes committed during wartime, not just as members of a defeated military or government, but as individuals responsible for their own actions. The trial set a precedent for the prosecution of war crimes and crimes against humanity, establishing the principle that individuals could be held accountable for atrocities committed in the name of a state or ideology. This principle would go on to shape the development of international law in the decades that followed, paving the way for the creation of international criminal tribunals and the prosecution of war crimes and human rights abuses around the world. In the immediate aftermath of the Nuremberg Trials, a series of subsequent trials were held to prosecute lower-ranking Nazi officials and organizations. These trials, known as the subsequent Nuremberg Trials, dealt with a wide range of crimes, from the abuse of concentration camp prisoners to the looting of art and cultural artifacts. In total, the Nuremberg Trials and the subsequent Nuremberg Trials resulted in the conviction of 1,416 individuals, with around 200 of them executed for their crimes. The trials exposed the full horror of the Nazi regime, revealing the scale and brutality of the atrocities committed in the name of the Third Reich. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.